It's the week ending Saturday the 20th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Donald Trump acquitted at his second impeachment trial, the release of tapes showing Princess Latifah, daughter of the ruler of Dubai, claiming she's being held hostage, and Anne Robinson announced as the first female host of Countdown. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Joe Evans, again, but this time served with the side portion of Arion McNicoll and a garnish of Kieran Yates. Excellent freelance writers both. Joe, you are starting this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The two new faces on the British media scene.
GB News, you got the other broadcaster shaking in the shoes. GB News, it suits me fine, free to air on Freeview, Virgin Sky, and streaming live online.
GB News by John the Music. You can find the whole thing pinned to Andrew Neil's Twitter profile. Joe, please elaborate.
I apologise for having attached that to this week's podcast. But the reason that I bring this is because Defund the BBC campaigners and various characters around the former Brexit Party have been lavishing praise this week on GB News, which is a new news channel launching, I think, next month, if their timetable is accurate. And it's the first big TV launch in a long time, possibly sort of the biggest since Sky News launched 30 years ago. And it comes hot on the tails of Rupert Murdoch also getting approval to launch a new TV channel called News UK TV.
And as you say, some parties are lavishing praise. Others are already warning about, what this is going to do to Britain's broadcasting landscape. But as Andrew Neil himself pointed out in an interview last week, this is before anyone's seen a single minute of content the channel has broadcast, either channel.
Yeah, so as you say, lots of journalists and activists have kind of gotten quite a twist over the launches of these two things. Partly, I think, due to the fact that Rupert Murdoch is closely involved in the News UK TV launch, and obviously he has his own reputation on both the British and international media scene. I think it's also partly because of where the funding for this stuff is coming from. GB News have got the backing of an investment group called the Legatum Group, which funds a right-wing think tank, and also one of their donors is a former member of the Vote Leave campaign called Paul Marshall. So, like you say, Andrew Neil has quite rightly pointed out that the kind of scorn is being poured on these projects before they've broadcast even a single minute. But I think the kind of where the funding is coming from and some of the characters involved in the launch of the two channels is kind of causing people to assume that its content may be of a sort of right-wing slant and that it's not great for media pluralism in that regard.
And perhaps the significance, therefore, Kieran, of this week isn't that the channels are launching next month. That's not much of a news story, really, is it? The significance of this week will be when we look back on it in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time and say, wow, was this the age of innocence when Britain was still in a world where essentially our TV news was provided by the BBC and Sky News, and it felt more impartial?
Wow, age of innocence. Don't know if I would quite use that term. But yes, you're absolutely right that this does mark a sea change, and it's kind of hot off the heels on things that we've already seen happening in the US. And so I think some of the concern over here has been looking at the blueprint of Fox News and saying we don't want to see a similar rollout over here. We know that traditional broadcasters are facing increased competition from online providers, and that often leads us to more polarised politics. We know that often the way that people use news and social media online is that they are driven by their confirmation bias. The algorithm then picks that up, and then this term, the echo chamber, is exacerbated. So I think that there are some very legitimate concerns about that happening, especially if we're moving into this sort of personality-driven news reportage, which I think this is kind of where it seems to be going on initial reporting.
Although it would seem slightly ironic to completely disparage that idea when here we are on personality-driven news reportage. I mean, Arion, when it comes to, the regulation of these channels, there's nothing different. It's still Ofcom. There's still British impartiality codes. They will be regulated in exactly the same way as the BBC.
That's true. And, both stations got their licenses because they agreed to be signed up to Ofcom in the first place.
And in fact, that's worth pointing out with the News UK one. that's optional, isn't it? Because they're not even going for a terrestrial TV license. It's online.
Exactly. So the fact that they're signing up indicates that they're happy to submit to at least a bit of regulation. But I think that the concern on that front is also that we're getting incredibly close to the appointment of Paul Dacre, who used to head up the Mail Group, as the new head of Ofcom. And so I think the concern from the people who, as Andrew Neil says, are already concerned about what these TV stations are going to look like before they've even launched, is further that if the regulator is being overseen by someone who has the same news inclinations as both of these two news stations, then you can potentially imagine a situation where they're going to run in a direction that does lead us down the track to Fox News in the US.
Well, Arion, let me just put to you a quote from one of your fellow countrymen about one of your others. This is Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia, talking about Mr Murdoch. Murdoch will say anything and do anything to win regulatory approval and then do the reverse in practice, he said. He's followed this formula to the letter in Australia. It will be the identical formula he will use in the United Kingdom.
I think that is a concern, and I think, Kevin Rudd is right to point that out. That's exactly what happened in Australia, where Murdoch oversees a great percentage of the press and also now has a couple of TV stations, a radio station. So really his stranglehold on Australian media is extreme. But I think that the proof will very much be in the pudding with these new things. Which direction are these two new channels going to go? We just don't know yet.
And Joe, you mentioned Sky News being the last news channel to launch in the UK 30 years ago. At that time, there were these concerns expressed about Rupert Murdoch, because he owned it then, having too much power and influence, and Andrew Neil, in fact, who's helping him set up the channel. But no one serious really criticises Sky News these days from that perspective. I mean, it's kind of widely accepted and wins more awards to be better than the BBC's rolling news.
No, you're quite right. And it is true to point out that, as you say, Murdoch was behind the launch of Sky News in the UK until it was sold to Comcast recently. And actually, when you look at the people that are being signed up for particularly GB News, Colin Brazier is one of the people that has been tapped up to go and work on the launch of this show. And he's a Sky News presenter and has been for a very, very long time. It should be said, on the other hand, you have people like Dan Wootton, who are coming over from The Sun. He's their executive editor, and he also presents a radio show. And he will almost certainly present a very different type of news. With Andrew Neil, who will also have a show, it depends whether you get the version of Andrew Neil that is on Twitter or whether you get the version of Andrew Neil that's on the BBC, because they are two very different characters. But as you rightly point out, these things will be bound by Ofcom, and even Paul Dacre, as chair of Ofcom, to an extent will also be bound by Ofcom's neutrality rules. It's not like Paul Dacre can walk in and tear up Ofcom's rulebook. And we know that Ofcom do tend to crack down on news organisations that step outside the boundaries of what they consider to be acceptable. Russia Today has been fined extraordinary sums of money for their coverage of the Salisbury poisoning. And actually, when Murdoch specifically has tried to bring Fox News to the UK in the past, it's been a dramatic failure because it's been repeatedly censored for its impartiality, which I think people should bear in mind when sort of getting very, very angry and even calling for advertising boycotts of two channels that are yet to launch.
But there's also, Kieran, the sort of British model for doing this kind of debate is probably going to be based more on LBC, the radio station, than it is on Fox News in the States, because that operates within Ofcom guidelines. And I think the point about LBC that sometimes people miss, especially people who don't listen to it very much, is they see the lineup and they think, Nigel Farage has his own show, how hideously right-wing this station must be. And they forget to realise that the point of Nigel Farage having his own show is it's then 2 hours of people calling him up and telling me he's an idiot. I mean, that's the format. So you're very much having both sides of a debate represented. It's just that, in the presentation of the channel across the day, you're representing political opinion rather than neutrality.
Well, that's true. But it does mark a shift, doesn't it, in giving a platform to more polarised political opinions. But interestingly to me, it's that the medium is significant because we do hold TV and radio regulation to greater account often than we do with social news. This report from last year from the Oxford Institute report showed that following COVID news and the sort of proliferation of fake news and anti-vaxxers online, there was a 20 percentage point switch from online to TV news. So there is an idea, whether fairly or not, that people go to these traditional media to look for truth. And so if this starts getting penetrated with, sort of these, not sinister, but these kind of outside influences on politics, then that's when it becomes tricky. I think a lot of people use social networks, but they are aware that they're not always the most trusted sources. So I think the medium is significant, and that's something that we will be talking about, because this is obviously a response to what we're seeing online.
But in Britain, Arion, are the concerns of Daily Mail and Daily Express reading Brexit voting Boris Johnson supporters legitimate, in the sense that, yes, there's lots of their voice on social media and in newspapers, but actually maybe they're not represented in broadcast news like perhaps they should be, given the fact that Boris Johnson is Prime Minister, on the basis of getting Brexit done?
I think there's something to that, and there's definitely room for a more plural media. There's always room for a more plural media. So if you have a sensible right-wing voice, then so be it. I don't think that that in itself is a threat, but I think that people do keep imagining that these two stations are going to go down a slippery slope towards something like Fox. But I think even there, it's worth looking at the fact that Fox in the US, even post-Trump, has seen its fortunes start to flag immensely after pretty much 2 decades of absolute dominance. For the first time in the first 2 weeks of this year, it became only the 3rd most viewed cable news channel behind CNN and MSNBC. So, the formula isn't even working over there. So whether it could translate and transpose over to the UK is a huge question, and I don't think that we have the answer for that yet.
Yeah, and finally, Joe, on this, it's quite interesting, isn't it, to think about what this story does say about Fox News in the States. I mean, they were such a hugely powerful, influential broadcaster when we knew that the president was watching them for his news. And it strikes me that had this been just 4 years ago, new entrants in the UK would be proudly trumpeting the idea that they were the British version of Fox News. But now they're both at pains to say, oh, we're not Fox News. Do you think there's a way back for Fox in the States?
No, I think you're quite right. And I think actually, anyone that was being suggested that could possibly follow the success of Fox News would have been celebrating that fairly recently. But as Arion points out, their ratings are declining. They've had massive problems with their on-air talent, often related to things outside of work. And they're also facing a multi-billion-dollar defamation suit related to its election coverage. I'm sure there is a route back for Fox. I think the more interesting question is whether or not the Fox model will work in the UK, and frankly, whether the two models of these two news channels will work in the UK. I think the suggestion that these channels are going to serve an underserved audience is also slightly questionable. We've had 10 years of, if not conservative majority, then conservative-led governments. And I just think the idea that the media necessarily needs more conservative voices pontificating on politics, and whether that is truly the niche that these two organisations seem to think it is slightly questionable. So in that regard, I think actually it's going to be a real challenge to make these things succeed. But then if they are going to succeed, then having Rupert Murdoch and Andrew Neil behind them is definitely the way to go about trying to make it do.
It's a good start, isn't it? Incidentally, if you enjoy listening to conversations on this sort of topic, you might want to type the Media Podcast with Olly Mann into your podcast app of choice. #JustSaying. OK, Kieran, you're up next after this. OK, Kieran, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week diversity rockets ahead?
Remember when NASA sent a woman to space for only 6 days, and they gave her 100 tampons, 100 tampons, and asked, will that be enough?
A TikTok video there from B is Out of Control called 100 Tampons. Kieran, what was that about, and what has happened this week in the world of aerospace?
So you were listening to a viral TikTok video which refers to Sally Ride in 1984, who's a female astronaut being asked by NASA if 100 tampons would be sufficient for her 2-week stay in space.
Yes, seems to be the...
Yep.
I mean, I would assume the correct answer to that.
But it's relevant to the story of this week, which is that the European Space Agency has launched its first recruitment drive for 11 years, emphasising applicants who are women and with disability. So they're offering up 26 permanent positions, and the selection process starts on the 31st of March and lasts until October 2022.
You sound excited. Are you going to apply, Kieran?
Well, I don't have the adequate requirements, unfortunately.
Yeah, you need like a postgraduate degree, don't you? Engineering.
Yeah, you need natural sciences, engineering, mathematics, computer science, and 3 years of postgrad experience. So, Goldsmith's lit degree is not going to help me here.
But until now, people might have assumed that you also need to be incredibly physically fit. And, I'm aware of the Paralympics, for example. I'm not saying disabled people aren't physically fit, but clearly, if you're talking about actually going into space, I mean, people know that, for example, if you want to be an aeroplane pilot, you need 20/20 vision or something close to it. Isn't it a bit odd to say we are actively looking for disabled astronauts when you'd assume that you actually want the strongest, most athletic, able-bodied people as possible?
Well, it's because, as we know, diversity is good for innovation, isn't it? So the way that this is going to happen is actually enlisting the help of the Paralympics Committee, and they're using a traffic system of suitability for space. And so they're looking at various different disabilities, and they're calling the term parastronaut. And so the committee's called a Parastronaut Feasibility Project, and it is a global first, which is why it's really interesting for this story. But they're looking particularly at limb deficiency at the moment, with a move to look at other things. But the reason why this is interesting and this is important is because it's answering future potential questions. I mean, Scientific American reported on Chris Hadfield's spacewalk in 2001, where he lost visibility in his helmet. And then there was all these kind of conversations following that about saying, well, a blind astronaut wouldn't have had those same issues. They would have been able to navigate that spacewalk more effectively. And then there's all these things about, audio attentiveness would be higher, dim lighting wouldn't affect you in the same way, the smoke obscuring your view wouldn't affect you in the same way. So it is to say that we're going to start with looking at things like limb deficiency, but diversity is good for innovation in this very specific way, and it could really answer questions that future spacewalkers are going to ask.
Is it really about innovation, though, Arion, or is it about representation? Isn't it really about, and I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but it's about disabled people back on Earth seeing someone else disabled up in space and thinking, oh, that's great, I could do that. That doesn't necessarily mean they are the best candidate.
I see what you're saying, but there was a really nice quote from the European Space Agency's only current female astronaut, Samantha Cristoforetti, who said, "We didn't evolve to go into space, so when it comes to space travel, we're all disabled. Everyone's floating around not using, for example, the lower part of their body, and the British astronaut Tim Peake said that he wouldn't have any problems flying with a parastronaut for this exact reason, that when you're suspended in zero gravity, there's all of these things that can be achieved just using part of your physique. And as Kieran was saying, they're specifically looking for people who have limb deficiency as one of the areas of disability that they're asking for applicants from. So I think that, you could imagine why, just like that Scientific American article, people with different sorts of skill sets, like a blind person who is able to listen more keenly, might actually be useful in certain circumstances up in space.
Joe, what are they going to do to adapt the recruitment process then? Because it's quite intensive, isn't it?
Yes, and it's interesting that you bring up the Paralympics, because they are actually consulting with the International Paralympic Committee in terms of advising the selection of candidates with disabilities. One of the issues that they might face is that obviously spacecrafts are designed with certain assumptions about who will be sitting in the seats and operating the controls and things like that. So that is one of the reasons this is a feasibility study, because they are going to obviously have to adapt the spacecraft in certain ways to make it appropriate. The other issue actually is that lots of people with disabilities don't actually have access to sort of traditional pipelines into becoming an astronaut. For example, in the US and Europe, lots of astronauts come via the military, for example, because, as you say, being physically fit is very important, or has traditionally been considered to be vitally important. And those kinds of obstacles are likely going to have to be removed, because obviously people with certain disabilities, that door is closed to them, and so that will have to be slightly reconsidered.
There's also this issue as well, Kieran, I know from speaking to disabled friends of mine, that sometimes there's a feeling that, yes, it's great to show the abilities of extraordinary disabled people, but most disabled people aren't extraordinary, and what they're looking for is the ability to wait at a bus stop and have the bus stop for them. And actually, focusing on this kind of extraordinary achievement takes away from the day-to-day necessities that still are difficult.
But this is a story about scientific innovation. This is about gathering information from data sets who aren't usually represented in this field and seeing what we can learn from that. And so that's why this has really exciting implications for the future of space travel, but, across STEM and design and all of those sorts of industries, that this is this is certainly where the world is moving. And even, about recruiting more women, that isn't only about, the politics of representation. That's also because it answers real questions about suit design. Suit design have historically been made with men in mind, and that might be one of many reasons why we haven't had a woman on the moon as yet. This isn't about, look at this sort of, Barbie who is an astronaut. It isn't just about that kind of thing. It's about what can we learn? What are we going to see? How can we avoid sending 100 tampons up into space for 2 weeks? Those are the questions that we're answering.
Okay, so what kind of innovations then could we expect to see being developed?
Well, it looks like in terms of suits, there'll be development suits with better flexibility and more tactile inputs, looking specifically at things like how periods and sanitary products are used in space. I think that's a whole interesting sort of space to look into. Oh, no pun intended. Generally, this is about increasing the potential amount of people who are underserved in STEM. We know that based on data that 27% of those working in STEM are women. That's answering that question as well. What are the questions that we're missing? What are the questions that aren't being asked because they're potentially being asked by men or not being flagged up? And so I think that brings us into a really exciting era of space travel and space innovation.
And so what back on Earth, Joe, might we learn? I mean, space travel has given us a wealth of knowledge. What kind of things have been developed for space that now benefit us here?
Yeah, so there's various examples. Camera phones was something that were first developed for use in space, scratch-resistant lenses, CAT scans. So it's a fairly wide-ranging collection of things. As Kieran has said, developing technology for disabled people to use in space could potentially have ramifications for disabled people that aren't going to be fired outside of the atmosphere. There's potential for those things to be applied on Earth. Though it should be said that this reminded me of a story I heard a while ago, and I'm not sure how true this is, so any listeners should probably fact check it before repeating it to their friends. But a rumour was that during the space race, the US spent thousands and thousands of dollars trying to develop a pen that would work in space, because obviously gravity wouldn't drag the ink towards the nib. And the Soviet Union managed to get around that problem by using pencils. So not everything developed for space travel is super successful and very useful.
Okay. Arion, you're finishing the show after this. Alrighty, Arion, you are ending the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learnt that chit-chat isn't quite as chit as we all thought.
I was bored. Bored of repeating my elevator pitch. Bored of having the same meaningless conversation on repeat. Bored of small talk. And frustrated with being stereotyped and with the lack of connection in my conversations. I was surrounded by people, and yet I felt disconnected and alone. Because I am not just my job. I am not where I live. We are not our labels. We are so much more than this. I knew I was craving a deep and meaningful conversation.
A TED Talk by Georgie Nightingale, talking to strangers, having a meaningful conversation. Arion, we often struggle to have a meaningful conversation, despite having been colleagues for 4 years now. But what is the story here?
Yeah, divided by a common language, I think they say about Australians and English people. So this week, the vocationally focused BPP University, a university over here in the UK, began offering its law students what's thought to be the first module in the world on chit-chat. Which sounds a little bit absurd in itself, but it was brought about, or launched at least, in response to internal polls of students that found 43% of students at this university feared that they'd be judged by the way that they speak. And a good third of them said that they worried that they wouldn't know the answer to a question that they'd been asked. So this module was brought about specifically to address those concerns and also to try to help them get more confident at networking in a professional setting.
Okay, you've sort of justified the existence of the course, but still the idea of the course is just a bit buttock-clenchingly embarrassing, isn't it? Particularly for British people. Like, what are they actually talking about on this course? What do they teach you to say?
Oh my God. God, absolutely. And if you listen to the whole of Georgie Nightingale's TED Talk, you do definitely reach some pretty excruciating moments of advice, including this particular part where she says that really what you're trying to do is share the real you. And she says, when the staff at Pret ask you how you are, tell them the truth. And I was like, oh my God, you're that person telling the sandwich counter worker exactly how you are, you know, when they're just trying
It's been a tough year.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Yeah, I will have extra cucumber.
Yeah. But yeah, no, but other advice she offered, at least in that TED Talk, was the sorts of things that you might want to consider. Might include being curious about the other person, shutting up and listening, and asking great questions. Look, none of this is obviously rocket science, but maybe if you're telling it to the sorts of people who are struggling with small talk in the first place, then maybe it is beneficial for a percentage of the audience.
Well, I mean, I suppose the interesting thing might be to delineate who those people are, Kieran, who are struggling. Is it a generational split? Because it would be kind of easy to sit here as all of us being professional communicators and say, well, why would you have to be taught this? It's easy. And assume, therefore, that maybe people who aren't journalists might find it harder to do this kind of thing. But maybe it isn't that at all. Maybe it's age-related and a cohort of people being educated now who have done all their communication through social media, email, and don't know what to say at a party.
Well, it's certainly true that there is a generational divide when it comes to digital communication and the frequency with which some people use their phones or emails to communicate. And we've seen that with the way that language has developed, internet slang and all of those things. Even the OED corpus really shows us the way in which online language now really kind of dominates and is sort of split intergenerationally. But I suppose what I would say to the question of who really needs this is to answer the question why. And I was thinking about the sociologist Mark Granovetter, who coined the phrase weak ties in 1973. And he said that they really build up our social world and are directly connected to our happiness. So when he talks about weak ties, he's referring to anybody from, the barista, somebody who we might pass, our butcher, our sort of local taxi driver even, who takes us to work in the morning. These people who are connected to us weekly, they build up our social world, and without them we really feel a loss, which is particularly prevalent in this sort of COVID environment. So if you make the point that these are not only important for corporate reasons, but they're important for our social life, our mental health, our general happiness curve, then I think you start seeing why this might be effective. The problem is that everything when it comes to this is sort of justified under the corporate matrix.
Well, but in capitalism, Joe, that's maybe just a way of explaining why human connection is important, because it affects the bottom line, but also it affects the bottom line because humans value it. So, I mean, for example, it's lawyers, isn't it, who are taking this module. If you're a lawyer and you're going to a meeting with a client who may have had a very traumatic experience, might have been sent really threatening letters from the opposing side, might find the thing they're discussing difficult, and is spending a lot of money to be there, it's not just a corporate thing that you should make chit-chat with them when you arrive. It's kind of essential that you should establish that you're a human being.
No, absolutely. And actually, sort of not long ago, I was actually a reporter working on law firms. And I found it quite odd, actually, that the lady that runs this course said that it's a way of making meaningful connections, because having interviewed quite a lot of lawyers, they are absolute masters at saying lots of words and making absolutely no meaningful connection and saying nothing meaningful at all. But that is absolutely right, that, face-to-face communication, there's reams of psychological studies into the fact that that's how we best humanise other people, it's how we best create empathetic relationships with other people. And I think that's striking when you talk about the shift towards digital communication, that one of the reasons that the kind of level of discourse on social media is so often in the sewer is because it isn't face-to-face communication, which means people don't empathise with one another at all and would say things to one another that they would never, ever dream of saying to someone in person. And in that regard, actually, I think that, I'm not convinced that it should necessarily be mandated through classes, but in that regard, I think actually building up the capacity to just chit-chat with people again is a really important thing, and post-pandemic will be an important thing when we're all let out into the wild again and have to stop screaming at each other on the internet and actually hold conversations with one another in person.
I think the impulse as well of people wanting to make a good first impression, which is what small talk is when you think about it. It's those early bits of conversation that lead to the real conversation. That instinct isn't an incorrect one. The idea that you want to come across well is based on really good science. Apparently, according to a Princeton study, it takes people less than 1/10 of a second to judge one another's faces. And that's not only to do with their attractiveness, but people are also drawing instant judgments about things like complicated stuff like competence or whatever. But even once you start talking, apparently the first thing that people say, according to a Harvard study, doesn't matter too much. So an opening line like, hey, how's it going? You know, bad weather we're having or whatever, doesn't really matter. But it's the follow-up questions, the immediate follow-up questions that are really critical. And that, I think, is where perhaps a little bit of attention on how you're doing your own small talk, and a class like this, if done well, could be beneficial, actually is really useful.
And also, Kieran, just to reflect on our previous story about diversity, you know, I wonder the extent to which this sort of class would actually help people or help a greater proportion of people that maybe are from BAME backgrounds, women, people who haven't been to public schools, people from disadvantaged backgrounds, in this particular kind of old school Oxbridge Boys Club of the legal profession. I guess making that impression is quite important and not something that's naturally going to flow.
Look, there's certainly an argument to support that. You know, I think from working class BAME communities specifically, there is definitely a language that needs to be adopted in some corporate spaces. And, you know, there are conversations being had about how often, you know, language and offices are not designed with people from those marginalised communities in mind. And the first indicator of that is some of the opening conversations, things like humour, things like cultural reference points. And so I think that this...
What college did you go to?
Exactly. This could be a way of penetrating that. But I also think that if we're talking about diversity of generation, the workplace is still quite early to look at or study at the impact of digital communication and how that might actually benefit a generation who are really adept at using it appropriately. Because we know, you know, we work in journalism, we know that the most sort of cringe or, you know, disturbing reportage is often because, you know, maybe a newspaper has misrepresented the nuance or, you know, of something that's said online, or a piece of slang, or, you know, some text communication. In which case, if we are looking at the corporate world, then of course Gen Z have a massive advantage because they know how to do small talk over Zoom more effectively. They might know how to do small talk, you know, over voice notes or, you know, WhatsApp. And I think that, you know, we're early on in this conversation, but that could really lead us to see this massive gap in the workplace where, you know, older generations, millennials, are really outside that conversation and are increasingly obsolete because this is you know, digital communication is really the future. And I don't know how much I would say that the text message has killed off IRL small talk, but I would definitely say it's something to think about.
So actually teaching older colleagues, Joe, how to use TikTok might be as relevant.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I heard it said recently, actually, that if the phone call was invented after the text message, everybody would use the phone call. And that because if you were told you can only send messages by sending strings of words to one another, and then they said, you know, we've invented a way that you can actually talk to each other, everyone would say, oh, that's brilliant. Why have we not been doing that the whole time? So yeah, maybe it is a case of just sort of turning older people into less of a group of technophobes. One of the striking things I think about these classes is that one of the things the students said is that they're worried about how their accents will be perceived, how their choice of language will be perceived. And I think what Kieran was just saying is absolutely right. You know, we've polled this and we know the accents people like and don't like, and people tend to respond better to received pronunciation than, and this really annoys me, but YouGov polled it and Brummie is the worst accent, which is where I'm from. We know that people cast aspersions against people based on their accents. We know that people cast aspersions against people based on the way that they are first perceived. And it is a perception failure, isn't it? It's you perceiving a person as someone that you understand and recognise when you really don't. And so in that regard, you know, teaching a load of young people, especially if those young people are from underrepresented backgrounds, to better communicate in a corporate environment, if it makes people more comfortable, then that seems like a very, very good idea to me.
Well, okay. So on that point, Arion, if it makes people more comfortable, I do think there's a fundamental flaw with this idea, which is if I went into a party and felt socially anxious anyway, and worried about my skills and abilities to start a conversation, the last thing I would want is someone's rules in my head telling me how I should start the conversation. I mean, it just puts more pressure on a kind of performative element of what should just be, hello, how are you?
Yeah, maybe. But I sort of think that if that survey was correct and a lot of people were feeling as though they didn't know how to get started with it, even with something that sounds as simple as a hello, how are you, then maybe some of these skills, which would probably start out feeling awkward if you were applying them from a toolkit, maybe after a while they'd get more natural and your third or fourth small talk attempt would become more successful and you wouldn't any longer feel you needed to think back on it quite so mathematically. But it's worth noting also that our antipathy to small talk is nothing new. And in fact, I found this really interesting little tidbit, that the Philogelos, which was an ancient Greek compendium of gags that dates from the 4th century AD.
Amazing. Who needs holding?
Yeah. But anyway, it includes this joke, which goes, asked by the court barber how he wanted his haircut, the king replied, in silence. You know, our concern about feeling like we don't want to engage with people on that stupid chit-chatty level is something that's been going on for millennia.
Can I just make one point as well, which is that I think that COVID has really upended our sort of previous assertions about language and the way that we use it. Because I remember in 2008, Cancer Research did a piece of research and they said that 18 to 24-year-olds are 20 times more likely not to speak to their neighbours. And I would argue that COVID has changed that and actually maybe made it more likely that you might make a bit of small talk or maybe check in. And I would also say that COVID has also made it far more important that you can communicate digitally and use small talk online and use internet language and slang. So these things are changing, and it'll be interesting to see how things kind of resettle in the years and months to come. But I do think that this period that we're in has sort of made small talk maybe more important and more frequent, and digital communication absolutely essential.
Well, that is enough chit-chat for today. My thanks to today's A-star students, Joe, Kieran and Arion, for their stories this week. Remember, you can subscribe to this show for free. No law degree required. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.